Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Michael DeLappa, the Executive Director of LandWatch Monterey County. We're very glad you could join us today to learn more about how California and its cities can house more people and achieve zero carbon emissions. We're extremely fortunate to have Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg with us today. Mayor Steinberg has been a statewide leader on these issues for more than 25 years, and you're going to hear more about that. So I'd like to introduce you to our program for the next hour. But before we dive into things, I want to tell you a bit about LandWatch's work in Monterey County. I know some of you are new to what we do. After that, I'll introduce Ann Nodoff, LandWatch's board chair, who worked with Mayor Steinberg in the state legislature before he became mayor. Ann will introduce Mayor Steinberg, and we'll take questions at the end of his remarks. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll moderate that and ask the mayor. So LandWatch's mission is to inspire civic action that protects and enhances Monterey County's future. We use science and data to develop public policy. We take what we learn and then educate and organize residents to make public policies more effective. We collaborate with local governments in their adoption of laws and regulations. We monitor their progress. And when we have to, and only when we have to, we litigate as a last resort. On an average day, the LandWatch staff and our team of consultants review housing, climate, transportation, and water policies and projects, EIRs, and other technical documents. We meet with residents throughout the county, hold Zoom events like this one, and follow up with newsletters and action alerts. We're successful when we can convert our passion into action and get more people involved in land and water use decisions that affect their lives. These are some of the outcomes we seek: protection of natural lands and farmlands, more sustainable cities, better housing options, more civic involvement and leadership. We have 5 goals that guide our work. We've been established these back in 1997. Provide affordable housing for local working families and individuals located within mixed income neighborhoods. Establish urban growth boundaries that limit sprawl and make cities more sustainable. Establish strong long-term protections for commercially productive farmlands. Ensure there is adequate infrastructure such as roads, sewer, and water before developments are approved. And finally, improve the regulatory process by making it more effective, efficient, and accountable, in particular, lowering costs for housing in the right places. Here's my contact information. If you want, if what you hear today inspires you to learn more or get more involved, please let me know. Please email me. We can certainly use your help. And I also strongly encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter where you can learn more about ways to get involved in the community. So a very quick commercial break. I'd like to remind LandWatch's special circle of donors and partners to register for our annual luncheon on November 10th. Representative Jimmy Panetta will share his thoughts on the 2022 elections, climate, housing, and the future of Monterey County and the planet. If you're interested in becoming part of our special circle of supporters and attending, please email me directly. To reiterate, LandWatch is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational organization that does not endorse, support, or oppose individual candidates or political parties. So now I'd like to introduce my friend Ann Nodoff, the chair of the LandWatch Board of Directors. For 40 years, Ann was the California Advocacy Director for the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. She influenced virtually every significant piece of environmental legislation in California over those years. Since 2005, Ann has served on the board of the California Coastal Conservancy and more recently joined the LandWatch Board. In her own words, Ann is currently enjoying living on the river, advising clients, engaging in efforts to drive climate action, justice, beauty, and sustainability. Ann, the Zoom podium is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And I thought that was a really good overview of the important work that LandWatch does. So it's my honor to introduce Darrell. So Darrell, what can I say about Mayor Steinberg? Except that he's one of the most thoughtful, good listeners that I've ever met in public office. And I've met many over the course of my work as an environmental advocate in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. Many. Darrell stands alone in his ability to hear what people are really saying, and then to have the will and the skill to bring sides together to forge common solutions. And I've had a chance to work with him when he led the state Senate to pass transformative laws that connect land use and transportation with climate policy, do state water reform, and many other important issues. Excuse me. Now that he's turned his talents to local government as mayor of Sacramento, he's led mayors across the state to push for policy reforms and funding needed to deliver change at the local level. Mayor Steinberg is a trusted advisor to the governor and many federal officials, and we're honored to welcome him today to talk with us here in Monterey County about land use and the climate connection. Thank you for being here, Darrell, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Wow, thank you, Annie. I'm so grateful for your introduction and the kindness. And it's been almost a decade now since we worked together, and 15 years since we did SB 375 together. And I feel exactly the same way about you. I mean, rare is the advocate who can be both ideological, and I mean that in a good way, and get something real done at the same time. And that was the hallmark of NRDC and you. And we count as one of the great highlights of my life, and certainly my professional life, the chapters where we got to work together and accomplish so much. So thank you. And Michael, thank you so much. We are just sort of getting to know each other. We shared a valued friend in common, the late great state senator Gary Hart, who we both had the honor of speaking at his memorial service. And I'm just really glad we're able to get together and may it be the first of many times. And thank you to LandWatch for what you do and your permanent commitment to protecting our natural resources. So I want to talk today about SB 375, but SB 375 is just a bill. I don't want to give you just sort of a dry recitation of what the bill does. I want to give you a little context, and I want to give you some of the history here, because it's all relevant to the history, but also to today's great challenges. If the question before us is, can government reconcile the climate imperative with the need to grow and build more housing? The answer had better be yes, because if we can't, we're in big trouble. I mean, climate is existential for all the obvious reasons. It's only gotten more serious and severe since we did SB 375. And at the same time, we have this affordable housing crisis that I will tell you was not as prominent 10 or 15 years ago, at least in terms of the legislative attention. I think it's fair to say when it comes to infrastructure, that back in the day, back in the old days when I was around there, it turned out in 2014, even 2014, housing infrastructure was consistently subordinate to transportation infrastructure and even water infrastructure. It just didn't get the same political attention. It wasn't that there weren't housing bonds over time, but there was so little housing resource in terms of state commitment back in those days. There was no permanent source of funding. I had tried to do the thing Tony Atkins eventually did, the real estate transfer tax, but wasn't able to get the 2/3 vote to get that passed back in 2012 or 13. I got so desperate that in my last year, one of the things that I accomplished that no one really talks about, but it may be the most significant thing I did, was when the governor wanted to create a permanent source of funding out of the cap and trade fund for high-speed rail. I had some negotiating leverage and I said, well, Governor, I like high-speed rail, but I'm only going to agree to that if you agree to a continuous appropriation to take 30 to 35% of the cap and trade funding and put it towards housing, transit-oriented development, transit-oriented housing. And it created the affordable housing and sustainable communities pot out of the cap and trade funding. And it has generated billions of dollars for transit-oriented development since 2014. But when I look back on that, the reason I did it, I thought it was the right thing to do, obviously, but there was no other place to go when it came to housing. Because we had, unfortunately, in the height of the recession, eliminated redevelopment, which came with a 20% set aside. Truth is, the legislature actually kept redevelopment. There was a lawsuit by the League of Cities and the Redevelopment Association that ended up eliminating redevelopment, but we had no other source of funding. So climate and housing must go together, and infill must be the predominant source of funding and development if we're going to have both the climate that we need and to house our people. And so when we did this 375 back in 2006 and 7, it had decades of prior history leading up to it. The truth of the matter is that many legislators and governors had tried to create a state role around planning, transportation, and even though climate was not in the vernacular then, and air quality. And they had failed. Whether it was Speaker Brown's effort to regionalize government and give them more powers than the current councils of government have, that failed, whether it was various efforts to define smart growth or jobs housing balance and make that a part of how we determine where state funding should go, whether it was my bill, my tilted windmill bill in 2001 to regionalize sales tax as opposed to situs-based sales tax. It was AB 680. And I said that we ought to regionalize sales tax instead of having it go to the place where it's generated, because all that encourages is big box development. Whatever happened to big box development? Nobody heard the word Amazon back in 2001. But would also created sprawl. And as I like to say, when I introduced that bill back in the day, my picture was on the post office of every suburban post office in California with wanted posters, because in their view, I was taking their money. Well, the bill failed, took it far, but the bill failed. But there was a lot of hunger to try to do something. And so then when I left the legislature for an interim period between my Assembly and Senate tenures, the legislature passed, of course, AB 32. And all of a sudden now there was a climate umbrella with which to have a land use, transportation, and housing discussion. And so we, with the sponsorship of the NRDC, Annie, and the CLCV, Tom Adams, worked over 2 years to create what we called at the time a coalition of the impossible. We brought together the local governments, the housing advocates, the environmental leadership, and the BIA, the builders, to say, okay, we need to do something to address the relationship between land use, transportation, and our climate imperative. And the fundamental question that we asked back then that is still being asked today is this: does the state have any appropriate role in defining land use, transportation, and climate? Because there is a doctrine that I've never found in the Bible, by the way, but is apparently biblical in nature to some degree, that basically says local control must prevail, that cities and counties should not be told by the state of California how they should grow, how they should develop, and what they should do. So let's acknowledge that local control has its place. Certainly the state does not need to meddle in the unique cultures of our cities, our counties, and doesn't always have, or even often have, all of the answers for what the right approach or right public policy is. But I would argue, and I argued it back in 2006 and 7, and even though I'm mayor of a major city now in California, and I know I'm supposed to have a different opinion here, but I don't, that local control has gone way too far. It's gone way too far. It's either we have a housing crisis or we do not. And if we do have a housing crisis and we say producing housing of all types must be the #1 imperative, then how can we say that 500 plus cities and 58 counties get to say no under any particular definition of local control that they choose to put forward? I don't buy it. I don't believe it. And I think local control has gone too far. So now let me digress and go back in time. In the early 2000s, after my sales tax sharing bill failed, and actually SACOG, or Sacramento Area Council of Governments, almost broke apart as a result. Kind of feel bad about that, but I was trying to stoke a good and important debate about the importance of regional government. A guy named Mike McKeever came along, who took over as the executive director of SACOG. And he led our region through a very intensive, what they call blueprint process. And the blueprint process sought to essentially define urban limit lines without calling it that, but to have the regions agree to applying for transportation funding towards projects that were consistent with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, i.e. a smart growth strategy that was sophisticated. And it was a big success. Not perfect, but a big success. And so after the blueprint came out, I returned to the Senate and I said, I'd like to continue my sales tax sharing effort, but maybe the way to attack it is not through changing the fiscal system of the local governments, but maybe it's to address land use, transportation, and climate together in a way that maybe had a better chance to bring people together. And so we tried to demonstrate that a region could act together, not to impede local control, but instead to incentivize smart growth. And so 375 took 2 years. It actually ran aground, if you remember, Annie, in 2006. We didn't have it together. We didn't have the votes or the coalition. We made it a 2-year bill. But we decided to use that time wisely, and we just never gave up, and we got the bill. And the way the bill largely works, I won't try to get too much in the weeds, is that the Air Resources Board sets regional GHG targets for land use and transportation for each of the 17 metropolitan planning organizations. The regions then have a responsibility to try to put together a land use and a transportation plan that is consistent with their particular target. Our target in the Sacramento region now is 19%. It differs in the other 16 metropolitan planning organizations. And it's not a mandate. a region could blow it off, and that's a source of actual controversy today, which I will get to in a moment. A region could blow it off, but if they blow it off, they then are significantly brought down more than a notch in terms of qualifying for state and federal transportation funds for major projects. On the other hand, for projects which are consistent with their what we call sustainable community strategy, those projects have a significant leg up in qualifying for state and federal transportation dollars. Now, where does housing fit into all of this? Obviously, in order to meet the greenhouse gas emission reduction standards, it's not just about transit or about getting people out of their cars. It's about incentivizing creating more walkable communities, more communities that are bikeable. It means building communities where people live closer to where they work and where they play. I remember the time, again, to digress, back when I started in the legislature, back in the city council in the 90s, the idea that anyone would want to build housing or live in California's downtowns was like, that's never going to happen. Sacramento needs to have a bunch of office buildings. People will commute in. We'll build out this light rail system, but it is what it is. We need more parking. No one's living downtown. And of course, that's turned out to be incredibly untrue, especially as younger generations and older generations, frankly, choose a more livable lifestyle. Less space, but more ease in getting around and walking. The number of young people that I know now who don't own cars, now we've developed the gig cars and where people can rent electric cars to get around when they need it. I mean, the world has changed in a major way. So SB 375 is a pro-housing bill, but what happened after 375 was that, again, it's a long story, but the legislature, or I should say the legislature, cut redevelopment in half. The governor signed the bill. The League of Cities then sued, saying you have no right to cut us. The Supreme Court of California said, if it's all or nothing, it's nothing, and redevelopment went away. And what went away was the 20% set aside that was required under redevelopment for affordable housing. And so when I look at 375, I say this: I think it has changed the planning paradigm in California. I think it has been a big reason, not the only reason, because people do vote with their feet here. It's a big reason why the idea of infill and downtown living has become more of a reality. It has done many, many great things. But what's lacking when it comes to housing now in California and this housing crisis that it was evident back then, but it is now become the top political issue in California. The lack of affordable housing, and of course, its most attendant consequence, and that is unsheltered homelessness. We have not had enough money to be able to build the kinds of housing that we want to build. That's changed now over the last couple of years. I was pro tem in an era of great deficits. My job was to cut budgets while not hurting people, and that was tough. We did, you never see a bumper sticker that says it could have been worse, but it could have been worse. We saved more than we lost. But this era, Governor Newsom and the legislature have ungodly amounts of money, at least one-time money. And to his credit, he's put more money into housing, mental health, and homelessness than any governor before. I give him a lot of credit, and the legislature has done the same thing. And so there's always the need for more, but I've come to a different kind of place when it comes to housing, in terms of my own point of view. I think it is money, but I also think it is systems failure. Housing is an economic commodity, and I believe it should be a legal right for the people of California, at least some form of shelter or housing. I believe the same thing about mental health care, by the way, for people who are living on the streets and who are obviously sick. But there is no legal obligation for people. Excuse me, there is no legal obligation for government at any level to actually produce housing. There's a planning process. And again, the governor has done really well to try to make an example of some of these suburban cities who are blatantly, violating the law because they don't want more housing or more affordable housing. But there is no production requirement. And there is no individualized legal right to housing for anyone who's on the street. And I believe that the systems respond to what is required. Why is there no question that, I guess with some limited exceptions, every child has a free public school to go to? Because we require the building of public schools and we require free public education. We don't look at housing in the same way. If you can afford it, or you win the lottery ticket to be, in the top tier to qualify for a subsidy, then you get housing. If not, I'm sorry, you're on your own. And until housing, shelter, and mental health care become a legal right, I don't believe the systems are going to respond with the urgency and at the volume and at the level that we're going to need. Put another way, because I think this is, if I had an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, I never do PowerPoints or visuals, but if I did, it would be an empty piece of paper. And I would write a line down the middle of it. And on the right-hand side would be obstacles to housing. And on the left-hand side would be obligations to build housing. And on the right-hand side, I'd have a long list. I might need 3 pages. I need 3 8.5, 11 pieces of paper. Because it would be not in my backyard. It would be over-regulation. It would be lack of housing innovation, why we don't build more manufactured housing in this state at a lower price point and faster to scale is beyond me. I love permanent supportive housing and apartments and all that, but they're expensive and it takes a long time. Excessive local control, the list would be long. On the left-hand side, I'm sorry, I wouldn't have much to put down on the paper, except for a housing element law, which requires you to plan for enough housing. But the forces on the right-hand side are much more powerful than any of the forces on the left-hand side. And you'll wonder why we have so many people who are unhoused, because it's damn tough to get approval for the right kind of housing development and expensive to build. So how does 375 then need to be improved 15 years later? I do think that there is a significant amount of room to shift it from what I call a hard carrot set of incentives to some more requirements, housing and infill housing being at the top of the list. And I just gave you the example of what I would do. I would create legally enforceable production standards for cities and counties to have to meet and make sure that they've got the money to be able to do so. Either we accept the fact that 173,000 people are homeless, the vast majority of them unsheltered, or we make this the same priority that it took to build public schools and to move towards ever increasing percentages of renewable energy as a mandate, not as an aspiration. There's another area, and I'll conclude with this, where I think 375 needs to be improved, and it's an area that I'm currently in the middle of as mayor of Sacramento. Because we were never able to achieve a mandate for local governments to follow climate regulations or even climate goals, even though we wanted to, but it was a compromise, a principled compromise. There is nothing in 375 that requires local transportation agencies to follow any climate analysis and or to mitigate any climate impacts. There's just nothing in the law that says it. And so what happened in my county is a group of business stakeholders, developers, who want to build a development out of the outskirts of Folsom and Elk Grove developments in our county, put forward an initiative that would allow the construction of a major bypass roadway and did not put any climate requirement in the initiative. I threatened to oppose it and got their attention. And so they sat down with me over several months and we negotiated a binding MOU, a side agreement, that brought SACOG back into the initiative and said that for any major roadway project, they have got to get SACOG sign off. SACOG gets to do the climate analysis and they have to follow SACOG's recommendations on mitigation. And so now I support the initiative, even though some of the environmental communities, including Mr. McKeever and some of my friends, think that the MOU may not hold up over time. So here's what my response is. I want to go back to the legislature next year, even though I'm not in the legislature. And I want to work with a good author to basically update SB 375 and require that local transportation agencies follow the regional government's recommendations on climate impacts of any new roadways, and to mitigate 100% of those impacts. And so that will be an interesting and important debate next year in the legislature. And again, I don't have a place on the floor, but I think we can get that done. And so it's quite the journey as we try to save the planet and as we try to house all of our people. And I think 375 laid the right foundation for being able to accomplish both. In some ways, the challenges and problems have gotten worse since 2007. And so it's time, like with any good law, to look at it, to update it, to improve it, and to make sure, as the governor says, that it can actually meet the moment, because there's such tremendous need out there. And I encourage you to continue to insist that it's not either or, it's got to be both, and we can do it. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the great overview of 375 and your work on housing and climate. And I think you're right, we've still got a lot of work to do. So I've got some questions that have come in the chat, and I have a couple questions myself. I think Annie does too, but let me start with one from our friend Elizabeth Madrigal, who works with the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership on many of the same issues we work on. Her question is, having grown up in Monterey County, the inequities between the Salinas Valley and the Monterey Peninsula have always been prevalent,
Right.
but they seem to be all the more exacerbated now as the housing crisis has gotten worse. In your mind, what are the best ways to actually ensure high resource areas are meeting their fair share of housing, especially for the workforce that is faced with a 1 hour plus commute each way?
By actually requiring them to build more housing. Look, I shouldn't skip over the fact that the legislature and the governor have actually done some good work on changing this local control state imperative balance here. I mean, Tony Atkins' bill, SB 9, that allows duplexes or triplexes as of right. The laws that allow ADUs to be built as a matter, accessory dwelling units as a matter of right. This year's bills that allow commercially zoned land to be built to have housing built by right. These are all good positive dings at the big local control wall, right? And I think they're impressive. I mean, in my city, ADU production has gone up dramatically, over 100% over the last couple of years. That's great. We are producing more affordable housing. The governor's got his task force of a bunch of top-notch lawyers who are looking at all these cities that aren't even doing the right sort of planning. But the only way is to require production, and also this issue of housing innovation. Why is it that the only model we really know and build to scale for affordable and workforce housing in California is tax credits with huge subsidies required of local and state governments to build a single unit? You've seen the numbers. I mean, in Los Angeles, and I don't know what it is in Monterey and Salinas, but the price points are $500,000 or more per unit for a single unit. Well, you don't have to be a math major to know that you're not going to get to the volume that is necessary. And so where is the manufactured housing revolution? Why aren't more of the state and federal funding streams pinned to building housing at lower price points, lesser subsidy, and faster to build? I mean, and there's a lot of models out there. Some of it's tiny homes, some of it's manufactured housing. There are new factories and all this, but the system, our state system, has not yet linked itself, in my view, sufficiently to scaling up these models because, and by the way, most of these products are great quality. I mean, students would live there. People could choose lifestyle-wise to live in a tinier home because, and that's conservation, by the way. But the systems are not required to build the scale, and we have to continue to strengthen the state law to require recalcitrant cities and counties to do more. I'm seeing it now. I'm living it. We're around homelessness in my city, in my county. The city's not a health and human services agency. They blame the cities. People think the city and the mayor is responsible, and I hold myself responsible and accountable. But I always say the city is not a health and human services agency. We don't do mental health. There's no right to mental health care in California. And how are we going to make sure that the people on our streets get the intervention in these tent encampments, the services that they need to navigate to housing and the permanent services they need? So more to do.
Great. I have questions are coming in very quickly. One from Kathy Durbin. All efforts to strengthen SB 375 requirements and reduce VMT by Senator Allen and this year by Laura Friedman have been blocked. How can we win on this issue? What will it take?
Well, I think the right idea, and I'm going to talk to some of the member Friedman. We worked a little bit with her last year, but the right idea is to take the business community supported idea that local transportation measures and the specific investments within them, especially the roadway projects, need to be scrutinized by the climate overseers, the COGS, and that the transportation projects don't get funded even locally unless they are fully mitigated. That the business community supported in Sacramento. So let's take that and let's now apply it statewide. And I know I'm going to be very directly engaged in this to whatever degree that helps or hurts, but we have the right idea now. I know that there were, I know what the efforts were with Laura Friedman, and I think she's great, and I appreciate her wanting to strengthen it. But I think it takes the right idea, and what we accomplished in Sacramento this year, even if it was messy, I think is a template for how to do this statewide.
I would just add to that, if I could, that You know, one of the bills this year that Assemblywoman Buffy Hicks carried really brought labor to the table for the first time in some of these housing solutions. And I think that's going to be part of moving forward as well.
Let me ask another question from Don Murphy. His question is, you mentioned that local control has gone way too far. Many people seem to believe in local control. What arguments would you use to help change people's minds about that?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I got distracted for just a second. I apologize.
No problem. You mentioned that local control has gone way too far. Many people seem to believe in local control. What arguments would you use to change people's minds about that?
That the current balance is not getting the job done. I mean, are you satisfied with the numbers of people living on your streets? Have you, I'm talking to any citizens, have you thus opposed more shelter or more affordable housing in and around your neighborhoods? I mean, what do you want? Do you want the streets cleaner? Do you want people taken care of? Do you want people to have a safe, dignified, and decent place to live? If the answer is yes, then the current balance is not getting the job done, because there are too many instances of the ease of stopping good and necessary projects. And it takes too long. It takes too long to build. And it's too expensive to build. And so I think sometimes we let each other off the hook in terms of not being consistent around asking and answering the question. And ultimately, it's strong leadership. I think the governor has shown it. I think the legislature has shown it by their willingness to take on some of these tough issues. You know, the other one they did this year, which I thought was provocative and that I supported, was the care court bill. And I know it was controversial among some of my friends in the civil liberties area, because it would allow a judge to require somebody to accept housing and treatment. But you know, the part of the bill that nobody focused on, I did write an op-ed that maybe was seen by my mother and 3 other people, that I wrote that you guys are all missing this. What's really relevant about this bill is it would require the counties for the first time to actually provide care and housing for people. And if they didn't do so, they'd be fined $1,000 a day. That's why I was so passionate about the importance of the bill. So, you know, these battles are all won over time. And I'm not saying the state is always right. I'm not saying that local control, please don't misunderstand me, that it's a completely inappropriate doctrine. I'm just saying the balance is too far. And housing, if you believe housing and mental health care are civil rights issues, then where are people going to live and where are they going to get treated? And if there's civil rights issues, then I'm sorry, state policy overrides local objections. And, you know, I'm sorry, you look at it, and I'm not saying that God, this could be so misunderstood, and I don't want to be misunderstood. But back in the day, segregation was a form of local control. I'm not saying that people today in California are practicing segregation. I'm not making that accusation or trying to compare them exactly. But there is a form of economic segregation. When you look at, you know, that there are a lot of people that are doing well and making it just fine, and there are a lot of people who are hurting. And I just don't believe we should stand in the way of providing safe, dignified housing and shelter and care for people who need it.
Let me, I'm going to ask a couple questions myself. You know, one of the problems is there's just this great resistance to change. You know, some people have called it the narcotic of nostalgia. How have you overcome the resistance to change in Sacramento, specifically around single family zoning? Because that is a huge issue.
We just did it. I mean, and yes, there were objections, but we just have gone ahead. And, you know, we were designated as one of the first pro-housing cities in the state. Proud of that. I think we've got the right policies, and we still have a major problem. You know, it's still not enough. I do think leadership and political will matter. And, you know, the big city, it's interesting, the League of Cities, you know, which I'm a member of, and I love their leadership and all, but the problem with the League of Cities is that they are 500 plus cities, and by definition, associations often have to play to their lowest common denominator when it comes to actually pushing change. And so the big city mayors, 13 of us, formed about 10 years ago. And we've really taken on an increased leadership role because we don't have the luxury of being able to say no. We want more state resources, certainly, and I know that's not uniform, but I want more state leadership. I do. I want to take care court, and I want to make sure that that gets translated into a legally enforceable right to care for people. That's what I want. As I said, I'm for a right to housing. I'm also for an obligation for people to accept it when it's offered. I don't know whether we'll actually get there, but we need to keep pushing until we've made much greater progress on the problem.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think Annie's got a question. But the last question is from Jean-Michel, and his question is, market-based solutions appeal to many across the political spectrum. Are there more market forces we can lubricate to move toward climate responsibility in development? Carbon fees, question mark. Gas taxes, question mark. Housing insecurity is a complex problem to be solved, but the climate disaster demands our immediate attention.
The answer is yes. I mean, I introduced a carbon tax, remember, Annie, back in 2014, and it was well ahead of its time because cap and trade was still, you know, the way we went about it, and with a lot of good results. But yeah, I believe that we need to continue to pass laws that send market signals to the private sector that you need to adapt or change your business model because this is where we have to go together. I think a great example of that is the renewable portfolio standard. And I know that it's never one thing, but the renewable portfolio standard in California, which, you know, started modestly and its percentages have increased, that is a requirement. You know, it's a mandate. And I think it sent the right economic signal to the private sector that said renewable energy, clean energy is the future. And yes, there's a dollar to be made here. But it's only that interaction between the public policy and the private sector and the public sector that are going to make the change. That's why with housing, so people say to me, they don't understand, why this right to housing? Wait, what do you mean? You're really going to like give this over to the courts and let, you know, courts decide? I go, you guys, you're missing the point here. Court interaction or court intervention is the offering. It's maybe the ultimate remedy, but the idea is to change the culture and the thinking around what is required and what is not. If housing is required as a matter of right, just like the renewable portfolio standard, in my opinion, it's going to create a different kind of a mindset, a market signal, for example, for the manufactured housing industry, because, oh my God, all of a sudden, we better figure out how we're going to create some form of dignified quality housing for people if this is going to be a legally enforceable right. And whether or not you have to get to court on behalf of an individual or on behalf of a large group of individuals is secondary. It's relevant, but it's secondary to saying what the law is and then moving towards what you're trying to get. I just see, you know, I ask the question, okay, why aren't there more county-based mental health services on the streets of Sacramento? Why? I come up with a pretty easy answer. It's because they're not required to. Because there's no obligation to. I'm not saying that the law can create nirvana or perfection, but we do kind of reap what we sow. We do kind of get what we say we want. If housing is purely an economic commodity, production is a matter of local discretion. There are my 8.5, 11 piece of paper. There are more obstacles than there are obligations. Well, then you're going to get the result that we're getting today, which is a lot of housing, a lot of people, we help a lot of people, but oh my God, people are not making it in this society. This is systemic poverty. This is low wages and high housing costs. On the housing side, we've got to create more supply of all kinds. And the laws don't push it hard enough.
Agreed. Annie? You're unmuted.
You're on mute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. You've talked a lot about this, Darrell, and requirements. But we've seen over the years that local governments just ignore the regional housing needs requirements. They go cycle and just ignore it. So there clearly is a need for more enforcement, and the Newsom administration is making steps there. I just wonder if you have observed, has that gotten local government's attention? What do you think in terms of the prospects of local governments taking their housing allocation seriously going forward?
I think it's a great move, but I worry that so many local governments can wait out the state government if the tool is not robust enough. And it's just, to me, the essence of it is the planning part of it. It's that we only require the piece of paper for cities and counties to plan for their housing future. And planning is important. I don't mean to underestimate it, but if it's not accompanied by some push or imperative to actually produce, I fear that even with the great effort, of this new enforcement unit, that the cities that are recalcitrant are going to outlast the will and the resources to do it that way.
Okay, well, you've been very generous with your time and very insightful with your remarks. Very grateful you could join us.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie. Thank you for the nice introduction of the mayor. We hope to have you back. We hope to have you in person in Monterey County sometime. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. I want to remind you to subscribe to the LandWatch newsletter. And if you're interested in the November 10th event, send me an email and I can tell you more. So again, thank you so much, Mayor, and hope to see you on the coast.
See you guys soon. Thank you so much.